Good evening and welcome to this October edition of the Australian-New Zealand Women's Human Rights Campaign. My name is Janet Fraser and I'm a volunteer with the Feminist Legal Clinic in Exile. Our principal solicitor, Anna Kerr, is doing tech with Kate Williamson, so thank you to those women. I live and work on Darug and Gundungurra outside of Sydney. Wherever you're coming from this evening, we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations across the continent. Tonight we'll be dealing with Article 7, participation in sports and physical education. Women and girls are objectively physically different from men and boys in ways other than reproductive capacity. For women and girls to have equitable opportunities in sports, certain sports activities must remain single sex. We are very fortunate indeed to have Linda Blade. Linda Blade is a former national champion of Canada in track and field heptathlon with a PhD in Kinesiology. It is acknowledged by those who live and work in Edmonton, Alberta, that they reside on Treaty 6 land, the traditional territories of the Cree, Dene, Stoney, Saulteaux and Blackfoot First Nations. For the past 26 years, Coach Blade has run a private consulting business as a sport performance professional coach in Edmonton, Alberta, working with athletes in over 15 sports, beginner to elite. Since 2014, Linda has also served as president of the board for Athletics Alberta, where she has a duty to represent the province of Alberta at Canadian national sport policy meetings. In a bid to increase public awareness of the threat posed by gender ideology, Linda has partnered with journalist Barbara Kay to author a new book titled Unsporting: How Trans Activism and Science Denial Are Destroying Sport. So look out for that one. Would you like to introduce yourself and give us some details of your involvement in advocating for women's sex-based rights? Thanks.
I am a coach of track and field and sport performance, as Janet read, here in Edmonton, Alberta. That whole career I've had was thanks to a scholarship at the United States University of Maryland with a full NCAA scholarship. I was Canadian champion in heptathlon. In fact, I was competing with Jane Fleming in Europe and in many different places during that time. And some of you from Australia might know Jane Fleming. So since then, I also have acquired a bit of a leadership role as president of track and field in Alberta, Athletics Alberta. And it was in my involvement, and I'll explain that later, but it was my involvement in the policy meetings that led me down the rabbit hole of gender ideology and self-identification of males into female sports. And so the frustration surrounding that caused me to partner with journalist Barbara Kay and write a book. And so, that's basically my story.
What made you first realise transgenderism is a threat to women's rights?
Well, I believe it was in a meeting in January of 2018 where I was asked, as one of the presidents of the province, of one of the provinces of Canada, that I would be on a gender committee. And of course, I being the token woman, because everybody else in every other province, every other president was male. And of course, they had to put a woman on a gender committee. And so they said, well, we're starting to try to formulate a policy surrounding participation. And of course, with my PhD in human biology, it was kind of confusing because I'm thinking, well, why would you do that if we have males and females? And so I started reading the document that was coming out from on high in Canada, where it was saying that really what we ought to be doing is allowing athletes to identify into any category they want at any time. In fact, the policy that I read at that time continues to be the most extreme policy in the world of sports, far more extreme than the IOC. This policy in Canada would say that if we accepted it, that a male body or a man could actually just compete in one sport as a male, let's say volleyball one season, and the very next season could just say, I feel like I'm a woman this season, I'm going to jump with women's high jump or something. And it doesn't even have to be season by season. It could be day by day. It could be week by week. They can go in and out of the category anytime they want. I just couldn't believe it, because anybody involved in sport knows that there's a huge difference between males and females. I mean, you just look at the world records, and all my colleagues sitting at the table know this. They knew that. And I looked around the table and I said, well, this is crazy. Are you kidding me? And expecting them to smile and wink and say, yeah, you're right. That's not what happened. They all went silent and they looked at their hands, they put their heads down and basically shrugged and said, well, what are we going to do? As if somehow they were helpless. And these are the leaders. These are our leaders. These are the people who formulate our policies. And for me saying, no, this is not appropriate and it's not right, I mean, it was sort of like I was the inconvenient person in the room. And so in that moment, I realized that the stone cold silence of peers and the immediate feeling like somehow I was the person who was the bigot and doing something wrong when I was clearly right, it just propelled me to get more involved, because you can't stand for that kind of insincerity and basically lying. It's a lie. So I'm not going to stop.
Would you like to tell us a little more about your area of activity, where you're focusing your efforts to resist gender identity ideology and where that's taking you?
Yeah, so I've been quite active. One of the first things I did, as I mentioned, that the awakening was in January of 2018, and by the spring of that year, so in Canadian spring, which would have been March and April, we had our annual general meeting, and where I had to, every 2 years I have to be reelected as president of track and field here in this province. So when I stood for my 5-minute speech on my candidacy to renew my presidency as leadership of the association, which represents about 3,500 people, there was about like maybe 50, maybe 75 people in the room, something like that. And I chose at that moment to say, this is a policy, this gender identity stuff is coming down the line. I explained it to the room, and I just spent that entire time talking about what that means for sport and women and girls. And I said, if you elect me as president for another term, you please know that this is what I'm going to be saying, that we need to compete on the basis of biology to protect sport. If you don't want me, your president, to be saying that, don't vote for me. And I was, reelected. 96% of people, a few abstained, but most of my members agreed with my position. And from then I really was interviewed by Megan Murphy. I just started talking more because I felt like I did have a mandate. I was honest about it. And I believe I'm probably the first person in the world who actually campaigned as a sport leader on this issue and got the mandate to talk about it. And so right away, I made the policy. One of the priorities was to instantiate a policy that fall that said that when you sign up for track and field at our level, at the provincial level for Athletics Alberta, you do sign up. There's a box for male or female. And then in our code of ethics, it says athletes are not to misrepresent themselves. If you misrepresent yourself, whether by age or you're competing for a different club, in whatever way you're misrepresenting yourself, that's a violation of the code of ethics, and that will be dealt with. And so we just went down systematically so that we would protect the categories. Now, having said that, I put that policy, the board and I, we put that policy in place in 2019 in the fall. Only this year is the national governing body. Now it's coming to a head where they really need to make a policy decision about it. And they're trying to tell me that this is illegal in Canada, what we're doing at the provincial level. And I'm standing my ground because it's not, because our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms does guarantee safety in biological sex and no discrimination on the basis of biological sex. So I feel like we need to stand our ground, and the meeting's coming up in December where it's probably going to really come to a confrontation about this. And then internationally, as Ro and Kath know, I'm at the ground level, and then at the international level, we are trying to bring together a consortium on sex-based sport where we found out that, after Laurel Hubbard, there was nobody representing women really at the table for negotiation. I mean, and we were worried that some group like the IOC might reach out to some group of women and say they consulted with women, but they didn't include our argument in there. So we're very concerned, and we just need the support of all the different women groups around the world to say, yes, this group of people, 3 of us, and there's a few more, do represent the women's point of view. And so I was just in France, and we're trying to put together a coalition so that we have a very strong representation when it comes to this issue of gender self-ID in sport globally. And once we have sort of something figured out there, so we have the top and the bottom, then nationally, then I think we'll start to formulate sort of an association for Safe Sport Canada to provide an alternative for the athletes and coaches to go to fight at the national level. So international, national, and local. I've done the bottom, I'm trying at the top, and then the sandwich in between once we get everything figured out.
Can you tell us a little about the opposition you faced and how this has impacted on you?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the main opposition continues to be at the meeting rooms, behind the closed doors, where they want everybody to have a consensus and nobody's supposed to argue. And you get that, cold shoulder from people during the coffee breaks. It's what's really fascinating is early on, I think it was in December of that 2018, we had an annual general meeting of the Canadian Athletics Canada in Vancouver, and we were meeting in a hotel, and they brought a woman in who's supposed to represent Canadian women and sports. That's the one organization that's getting government funding to protect women's sports. And this was the woman that they brought in to be the prophet for the inclusion doctrine. And this woman stood at the front of the room and lectured a bunch of us, coaches and administrators in track and field, that it's no big deal if men have a 12% advantage over women, and we should all be inclusive and accepting. And I started asking questions, just saying, have you seen, how do you reconcile the world record differences? Right away, they bundled her out of the room because what she was saying was so ridiculous. And she showed the genderbread person, and oh my goodness, it was just the most insulting thing I've ever experienced in a meeting nationally. And yet everybody was protecting her, trying to get her out of the room so I couldn't ask any more questions. And then nobody would, it's like one of those social things where everybody's really uncomfortable and they don't want to talk to you at a coffee break. And yet that evening when we went out for dinner at a really fancy restaurant, and people would sneak up to me at my table and say, I really agree with you, but I can't say anything. And it's just so ridiculous. If I say anything, I'd lose my job. And this is the report that Catherine was talking about. You probably can't see it, but anyway, it's the UK Sport Equality Group, the sport councils. And I will point out that in this document, there is a section on the bullying that happens to people in these sports organizations who try to say anything. And I'll just read a couple sentences if you don't mind. It said, when they interviewed over 180 people who work in sport bureaucracies around the UK, and it says, the overwhelming majority of people who consider fairness and safety could not be achieved with transgender inclusion into female sports did not feel confident to voice these opinions. Some said that they had been threatened with sanction or disciplinary action if they spoke out. Many of the interviewees who held positions with sporting agencies said their personal opinions were in direct conflict with that of their employer or agency's stated position. Many felt they had no option but to remain silent in order to keep their job. This was a frequently voiced frustration, which regularly reduced the interviewees to tears or hostility. This is the environment. It's so toxic. This is the environment that all of us in sport leadership are dealing with. These people are absolute bullies, and at every level. And it's not just grassroots level bullying, it's international level bullying. Do you realize that the person who's in charge of the International Olympic Committee Medical Commission actually has a family member who's non-binary, who is non-binary? So presumably the pressure on that person to make policies that are fair on the basis of biological sex makes them feel uncomfortable. They have complete conflict of interest. Can you imagine one person making policy for the entire globe of women in sport, millions of women, and he's being, basically his whole mind is made up because of a family member? Like this is utterly ridiculous.
What are the next steps for you and your organisation? And do you have any suggestions for the Women's Human Rights Campaign, and particularly for attendees? What can they do?
If any of you have family, friends, colleagues who have children at grassroots sports, as Ro has pointed out, you must try to talk them into being on boards of directors of the local sports associations so that their policies can be set in place to push back against this, insanity. Because I believe that the delivery of sport, no matter what anybody says, is by and large at the community, school, grassroots level. If you can fight that fight, you're probably going to have it won, because the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, and even the national sport governing bodies, they're just out there waiting for the product to come up from the bottom, it's all, I always thought, it's like there's a factory, like we have athletes in the factory at the provincial level, at our level, grassroots ground level. And it's like these guys in the leaders of the IOC and national governing bodies, it's almost like that they're standing at the exit of the factory door, waiting for the next Ferrari to come out so they can make their money. And so when they make policy that affects what's going on inside the factory with how we're building and training up the athletes, and they act like they just act like they can say whatever they want, and the rest of us who are working on the ground have to deal with it. No, we can actually say, no, that's not what we're doing. And so I believe that's where the fight can be, and it has to be. And further to that, I would like anybody who can support financially or in any other way, support Save Women's Sports Australasia, support Save Women's Sports USA, or support Fair Play for Women in the UK. These are great international level, really outward facing groups that you can actually help. And if you have any desire to have a Christmas gift, go to unsporting.com, buy a family member my book on sporting, because it explains the insanity quite well, I believe, even if I say so myself. And it's really more than the Canadian perspective. And finally, when Ro, Kath, and myself and a few other women finally figure out how we're going to do this international consortium on sex-based sports, we need the Women's Declaration and all those members to be behind us. If we can at some point get our act together and have all the women's groups from around the world say they support us, then when we finally get to the bargaining table, we can literally say we have 100,000 women behind us. We need to be able to say, this is the women's perspective. Okay, that's really what we need to do.
Welcome, Ro Edge, coming to us from New Zealand. Ro is the New Zealand spokeswoman for Save Women's Sports Australasia. She is a women's rights advocate who comes from a sports-loving family, so she has a special interest in ensuring girls and women retain their pathways to achieving sporting excellence. Ro's daughter studied under a university sporting scholarship in the USA, and her niece represented New Zealand at the Tokyo Olympic Games, so she has a passion for ensuring fairness and safety for women in sport. Can you introduce yourself to us again, please, and give us some details of your involvement in advocating for women's sex-based rights?
Surely can. I don't have an amazing CV, especially a sporting one like Linda, but I do have some protege that are very good at sports, and my niece especially, who attended the Olympics. I've got a real passion for, just ensuring fair and safe sport and opportunities for females in sport. So I became involved with Save Women's Sport through Speak Up for Women, which is a women's group here in New Zealand, in 2019, when they were first fighting the BDMRR bill here, which was for sex self-identification. So I sort of heard Annie on the radio one day and fell down this rabbit hole and ended up going to one of their events in Auckland and met them all, and ended up being invited to be part of their leadership group. And we decided that sports was a really great way of connecting with everyday New Zealanders, because sometimes, the whole women's rights thing, people just glaze over and they see the old bra burning feminists, that it's just the thing that comes into their head, which is so frustrating. But the sports gave us a real opportunity to connect with Kiwis. And I guess especially when Hubbard was selected, it just really triggered a whole lot of people. So we decided to set Save Women's Sport up as a completely separate entity, following what Beth Stelzer has done over in the US, which has just been amazing. So we set it up as a completely different organisation. My daughter was actually on a US college scholarship at the time as well. So the whole Title IX and just what Biden has done over there is just, it's just gut-wrenching, really, isn't it? How long that women and girls had to fight to get those opportunities, and how amazing it is when you do get them. It's such an incredible experience, and to have that undermined has just been so gutting. So it was actually through Senator Claire Chandler. I watched her do this speech one day in Parliament, and I was like, wow, over in Australia, she's a legend. So I messaged her on Facebook thinking she'll probably never get back in touch, but she did. And we kind of developed a bit of a relationship, and it was through Claire that I was introduced to Catherine. And so that's how Save Women's Sport Australasia kind of came about. So after talking to Kath, we realised that we were fighting the same battle, and even though they'd fallen down the rabbit hole a hell of a lot more over there were so many things that we were fighting that were similar, and that I think we both recognised we could be stronger together, and it actually helped Australia get up and running a lot quicker as well, because we kind of had the website and had a bit of the stuff already done. So while we work both independently within our own countries in our separate campaigns, it's been really valuable actually partnering, because especially during the Olympics, ironically, thanks to Laurel Hubbard, we managed to get both international and national media coverage, which was fantastic.
What made you first realise transgenderism is a threat to women's rights?
Actually, I remember, I think it was early in 2018, we had a number 2 world downhill mountain biker called Shania Rawson, and there was an article in the paper about how a guy had competed as a male right up until the end of 2017. They had a 3-week break with downhill mountain biking, and then he turned up and competed as a female at the end of January as Kate Weatherly, and basically took out the competition by 30 seconds, easily beating Shania and all of the other females, and there was no stand down period. And when I started reading this article, it begged belief, really. Kate had actually helped write the rules for Cycling New Zealand to change the rules to suit the ability for them to compete. And when Shania's father, Ash Rawson, who was he's an amazing athlete himself, a BMX rider and a coach, and when he questioned Cycling New Zealand on it, they basically just told him his daughter needed to try harder. And that was the response. And so that was my first introduction to it. And I guess, downhill mountain biking wasn't something I was completely familiar about, but I remember reading about it going, oh, this is just so wrong. What are they doing? It's completely wrong. And then I heard the interview with Annie O'Brien on the radio, which made me completely fall down the rabbit hole, because, she was mentioning the sex self-ID and all the implications, and she brought up the sporting stuff. And so I really started researching that. That's when I discovered about how Laurel Hubbard's father, who was incredibly influential in Auckland, had paid a hell of a lot of money to the Auckland Weightlifting Federation to help, ease the way in for Laurel as well. And just how women's sport was being undermined around the world with these stupid policies. And as Linda said, it's our sporting leaders. And that's what's so frustrating, is the sporting leaders are letting everybody else down, because no one else underneath that leadership area believes this is the right thing to do. But for some reason, these guys have drunk so much Kool-Aid that they just have lost the ability for rational thought.
Would you like to tell us a bit more about your area of focus and how you're resisting, and where's that taken you?
Yeah, sure. So as well as supporting Linda with what she's doing, and I just going back to your top and bottom, I actually think if we squeeze at the top and push at the bottom, we will impact those sporting leaders that, at the national level that are making the bad decisions, because it won't be palatable anymore to anyone. So hopefully there won't need to be too much pressure put on them. But yeah, so we're focusing really on the grassroots level. So what happened in New Zealand is when World Rugby brought out their amazing guidelines, and the process, etc., that they went through, the New Zealand Rugby Union received it, and they decided in their infinite wisdom to reject them. And by rejecting them, they then had to decide, to determine what their own guidelines were going to be. So they went to our national sporting organisation, Sport New Zealand, and said, look, we need some funding to create our own guidelines. And one of the big reasons that they actually rejected them is because the TRAs internationally just had a coordinated campaign, just hammering basically all of the rugby unions around the world. So you had to be a pretty brave rugby union to ignore all of that, whereas we were really nice when we approached them. We tried to have a reasonable conversation, thinking that that was the right way to go. But so they rejected them. They went to Sport New Zealand and said, we need funding. Sport New Zealand said, look, if we're going to fund this for you, we would like to, at the same time, develop guiding principles for all sporting organisations in New Zealand. And so that's what really sent us down the rabbit hole, because they employed a really woke consultancy firm down in Wellington who had already developed trans inclusion guidelines for a football club that basically said that anyone can identify into any sporting category and go into any changing rooms that they like. And they pretty much replicated that in a set of 12 guiding principles, which only looked at everything through the lens of a trans person. There was never any acknowledgement about the impacts on females at all, about having males in their changing rooms or in their sporting teams, or the fact that, the guys can, opt in and opt out depending on how they feel each day. It's just they were absolutely ludicrous. But we were involved, because we'd been involved with the New Zealand Rugby Union and talking proactively with them. They involved us in the consultation with Sport New Zealand's guidelines. And when they brought out their draft for consultation, they didn't put on it that they were confidential. So we decided we needed to get this out to as many sporting organisations in New Zealand as possible, but grassroots level. We needed to trigger people to say, this is what you're going to have to deal with, because it's not the sporting leaders that have to deal with if a bloke walks into a woman's changing room. How does the volunteer deal with it at a club level? Or if a boy is winning against girls in a girls running race and the parents on the sideline start going, this is really unfair, which is what's naturally going to happen. It's not the sporting leaders that are going to deal with that. It's going to be the grassroots organisations, which are all volunteers. I used to run one in New Zealand. It's completely manned by volunteers, and they're going to be the ones that are going to have to deal with this. And so we decided to target them, and Sport New Zealand got such a backlash, it even went up to our Minister for Sport, who said, hey, you've got to deal with it. And then we managed to get a whole lot of New Zealand athletes. I think there ended up being over 70 ex-Olympians and elite New Zealand athletes who signed an open letter to our Minister for Sport saying that they needed to extend the guidelines, because all of this consultancy firm we're consulting with were mainly rainbow organisations, academics, already captured sporting organisations. Like in Australia, they consulted with all the sports that had changed their rules with zero public consultation at all. Very few sports organisations and nothing at grassroots level in New Zealand. And so they were just talking within their own little echo chamber. And there was really only us and Professor Alison Heather from Otago University, I think, who gave them anything that conflicted with what they wanted to put out. And they just ignored all of us completely. So we kind of front-footed and got it out in the media, much to their disgust. They were appalled at our behaviour for making it public, but it worked in our favour. And what's been really interesting is we forced them into another round of consultation. They're not opening it up much, but we did manage to get a couple of other athletes, New Zealand ex-Olympians, to provide feedback on it, but it's all gone quiet. They haven't done their second round of consultation. The New Zealand Rugby Union, who were due to run their consultation with their members, and it was hilarious, they sent out the invitations, but they weren't announcing the location until the very last moment, and it was really, really limited with who they were consulting with as well. It's just secret squirrels, we can't let this get out. They've gone quiet too, nothing. It's like birds chirping. But my concern is that the government are pushing through the sex self-ID legislation. It'll probably go through within the next month, I would say. So the sporting organisations will probably then just fall back and go, well, we have to do that because that's the law now. So we are focusing, we've got a big campaign that we're going to be putting out to all of the grassroots. We're just going to hammer the grassroots and try to get an upswell from there, basically, and for them to push back at the regional and national organisations to say this isn't on. It's the best we can do at the moment.
Could you tell us a little about the opposition you faced and how this is impacting you?
Yeah, just like going back to what Linda said, like, you know, when the New Zealand Rugby Union got World Rugby's guidelines, we said to them, how are you going to consult with the female rugby players? Because you have to be really, really mindful about all the pressure that's going to be on them. It needs to be in a confidential manner where they feel free to give feedback without worry about reprisals. Anyway, they apparently did ask, and the female rugby players, the Black Ferns, you know, our elite women rugby players, said that they wanted them to accept them. And the NZRU said to them, do you understand all the research? And they said, oh, well, we probably don't because we haven't read it all. And so that was the justification they used for ignoring it. But anyway, so we did highlight that as well. So I guess for me, apart from being called a transphobe and a TERF, you know, and that I'm responsible for the potential death of trans people by saying that males shouldn't play female sport, the most frustrating part has been being ignored by the media. You know, we have a really big issue here and the media are too scared to broach it. I remember talking to one male journalist who read this press release I sent out, and he rang me and he said, look, I just want you to know I support you, but I'm not going to touch this. I went, why not? And he said, because I will get so much kickback, I just can't deal with the crap. And even the one journalist, like when we had the letter signed by over 70 athletes and we managed to get an exclusive, it was the second story on 3 News on a Sunday night, which is probably one of our biggest news channels. There's only 1 News and 3 News. The journalist that ran that, Karen Rutherford, she was incredibly brave for doing it, but I think she was also a little bit naive because for about 48 hours after that, every 2 to 3 minutes, she got an abusive email consistently all the way through. And so now she's too scared to touch it again. She hasn't said that she won't, but it was just, she just could not believe it. She has never experienced anything like it. And this is their strategy. They just basically, you know, keep boxing you down until you're too scared to have a say. And that's just been the most frustrating thing. But, you know, it was really only thanks to having amazing athletes who signed our letter that we managed to get in the media in the first place, because you can't ignore the likes of David Gerard and Alison Rowe and Lorraine Moller and so many other incredible athletes. It's just impossible for the media to ignore them. But yeah, we had one media outlet, this one journalist who used to ring me regularly, and she used to try to act like she was my best buddy and get me on side. And I'd always talk to her, but I never trusted her. And then one night she did a hit piece on us. She rang me at 4:00 in the afternoon, and it was something about us using unauthorized photos on our website. And like, seriously, it was so pathetic. And I'm like, she said, can you provide me with confirmation of these photos within the next 15 minutes? So we no, actually, I'm working, Zoe. I actually have a life. I'm a volunteer in this organization, but I'll ring my website company and I'll get back to you once I know. She published the hit piece anyway, and I ended up being online with her sports editor and head editor most of the night. The article was changed, I think, 3 times until it really became a story promoting us, which was quite good. So it went from hit piece to promotion, and she has tried to ring me and email me since then, and I just refused to take her calls. And I've told her sports editor I'm never dealing with her ever again because it was so unprofessional. But Yeah, it's always a bit of fun and games, isn't it? But the media has been the most disappointing part of this. And, you know, we saw all the way through the Olympics, whenever Hubbard was mentioned in an article and they posted that article to social media, they turned off the comments pretty much straight away because they knew the public would say stuff they didn't want to have promoted because it didn't fit the political rhetoric. And our government is just our media now is essentially the government propaganda machine when it comes to all of this stuff. So frustrating.
Some final words from you. What are the next steps for you and your organisation? And do you have any suggestions for the Human Rights Campaign and for attendees?
So our focus is on targeting the grassroots. So what we're actually doing is, thanks to those incredible guidelines from the UK Sports Council, we're actually currently rewriting Sport New Zealand's guidelines with 12 guiding principles for sports that we think they should adopt. And we're going to be sending those out to all of the sports, hopefully within the next 2 to 3 weeks. We're just waiting for David Gerard has offered to write another article and try to get it in the Herald and the Otago Daily Times. And we'll kind of want to spin off that because he tends to get a bit of press and coverage off that. But yeah, it's really, for us now, it's about preempting the next stage of Sport New Zealand's consultation because I can't see them changing. You know, everything is through the lens of a trans person. There's no acknowledgement of women and girls. To see them try to flip that now, I don't honestly know where they're going to go with it. And likewise with the NZRU. So we're just going to keep applying that pressure by sending out these new guidelines and putting the pressure, challenging all of our grassroots sports organisations to be the ones to make sure they protect women and girls in sports, because it's where it all starts. It's the funnel up to elite level. And if we don't get it right at the grassroots level, then we lose right at the beginning. So that's really our big focus. And then obviously to support Linda, and I can say that book is well worth a read, Linda. It's applicable. It doesn't matter where you are in the world. It's the same stuff happening everywhere. And plus it's got everything that, you know, just the information about what happened with the Olympics and how that all changed. It's a really, really good read. But in terms of what people can do, yes, obviously donations are really great. We run completely on donations and it's volunteers that do all of the work, but also it's actually applying pressure on your grassroots organisations and just challenging them and saying, what are you doing about this? You've got to protect women and girls. I think that's probably the best thing that you can do, is really apply that pressure.
Our third speaker, Catherine Deves, is an Australian lawyer, co-founder and spokeswoman for Save Women's Sport Australasia. She lives on Gaia Margal country. SWS is part of an international coalition of women athletes and their supporters who fight against identity inclusion policies and legislation that gives men and boys access to female sports competitions. When she is not taking her 3 daughters to their numerous sporting activities, she speaks and writes publicly against gender identity ideology. And you can find her at savewomensport.com, no apostrophe, and catherinedeves.com.au, Catherine with a K. Can you introduce yourself and give us some details of your involvement in advocating for women's sex-based rights?
I found myself falling down this rabbit hole. As mentioned, had 3 daughters, thought I needed to go brush up on my feminism, and went and found the state that liberal feminism is in today, and was quite horrified. Pro-prostitution, pro-porn, hypersexualization in the media, and women claiming that what they were doing was feminist because they were a woman and making a decision. And I thought this doesn't sound right at all to me. So kept looking, came across radical feminism, which made a lot more sense to me, and then came across the concept of the cotton ceiling and continued to fall down the rabbit hole. And like many of us, probably spent the weekend walking around the house, reading articles, swearing to yourself, going, what the hell is going on? So that was my journey into this world. But in relation to the sports, it was when Pride in Sport announced their gender inclusion guidelines for sports back in October last year, and I realised that there wasn't a concerted, organised pushback. And just through my connections in the network, I was speaking to Claire Chandler, and then she put me in touch with Rose. So Save Women's Sports Australasia was born. Yeah, so I mean, I've always had a very strong sense of justice and fairness and a very low tolerance for nonsense. So when I see all these policies coming through that completely erase the concept of biological sex in favour of a special self-declared identity, and with my little girls who play 7 sports between them, and thinking that I'm going to be doing all this driving around and all this effort for them to get to a level where suddenly a boy might be able to just self-select into their competition the following week and smash them. So I said, it's just ludicrous. It's ridiculous. And we need to have a concerted effort in pushing back, and we need to shine a light on this. So that's how I joined the fight.
What made you first realise transgenderism is a threat to women's rights?
So as I mentioned, the cotton ceiling and coming across the term TERF, which is, as we all know, just the modern day version of saying witch or bitch or any other of those slurs. And I realised that it was just misogyny rebranded. And this seemed to be a backlash to the progress that women had made over the decades and centuries. And this was just, misogyny rebranded. So I went looking into it from a legislative perspective because I'm a practicing lawyer, and I found that gender identity was already in our federal legislation, which is arguably unconstitutional because it doesn't have constitutional validity being there, because the way the legislation is set up, it's reliant on international treaties, and there's no international treaties that deal with gender identity as yet. So I was confused and asking questions because you've got gender identity there and sex, and there is an inherent conflict, and there hasn't been any case law yet, but it was looking like all the policies that I was coming across, all the publications, they were all favouring an interpretation that prioritised gender identity without considering at all the impact that would have on women. And then I came across some quite disturbing published articles in very reputable law journals where they were saying that they wanted to erase the concept of sex in law and policy. Now, I think we can all appreciate the dramatic impact, the catastrophic impact that has on women and children, because we know if the women aren't safe, children aren't safe. When men can just self-select into not just sports, but services and spaces. And I realized there was absolutely, so I started writing letters, asking questions, and I realized there was just no political appetite to deal with this. Everyone was just on board the diversity, inclusion, equality, trans train, and people were either, putting their heads down, like Linda said, they just were too fearful or lazy or cowardly or unaware. And I realized that things were really, really dire. And I feel like, we're all a bit Cassandra here trying to alert everyone to what is going to happen, but it's not, and no one's listening, but it's not going to be until we really see some of these things play out. And that's what we're seeing, like with Laurel Hubbard. That was a great example. Thank you, Laurel. You did us a big favor there. But when it's the poor women in prison in California, or the women who are leaving the homeless shelters to take their chances on the street instead of being locked in with some, looming trans woman who's, male with a trans identity, who's trying to intimidate them. So unfortunately, I think we're going to have to see this play out a bit more. But obviously, we can see it right in front of our faces. And this is just the latest attack on women.
Would you like to tell us some more about where you're focusing at the moment and where that's taken you?
Right, so we differ a little bit with New Zealand in that this has already taken place. So they have all the policies in place. This has been particularly driven by ACON, which is the AIDS Council of New South Wales, and they have their Pride in Sport franchise, which has pushed all these policies into all the sporting organisations. Now, they are very well funded by the New South Wales Minister for Health, who gives them $12 million a year in a special grant. And they have a whole body of employees and an army of volunteers and so on. And so we're really up against it just in terms of resources. So my tactic was, I feel like this is a fight against a hydra. We cut off one head and we end up with two. So we need to go for the immortal head and bury it forever chop it off and bury it under a rock. So this is where we needed to attack the legislation and look at the inherent flaws within the legislation and the conflicts there, and start to lobby for changes to make it, to clarify the law. Like in Australia with the sports legislation, it does say that we can exclude on the basis of sex and also gender identity. They stuck that in to confuse things, if strength, stamina and physique are relevant. And that's replicated in all the states. So what we need to do is we need to get clarity in the law. The other thing that we can also do is there are arguments being formulated that the insertion of gender identity is unconstitutional. So if we've got these legal arguments, we just need to have the complainants and we need to have the funding. We do have some very high-level legal practitioners who will be prepared to run it. So it's only a matter of time. So we're going to have to attack it differently. Also with ACON, looking at their funding. So they're very similar to the UK Stonewall. They run the Pride and Diversity Index, the Australian Workplace Equality Index, and they have infiltrated almost every single government department, all the corporates, all the law firms, and so on. So similar to what's just happened in the UK with the exposure of Stonewall's influence through the BBC, Nolan Investigates, the exact same thing has been replicated here. So we're a couple of years behind the UK in this battle. So we're gathering all the evidence, we're gathering all the data, we just need to get it out into the public domain, and we need to lobby the politicians to actually do something about it. Because one thing that I've noticed in this fight, whenever I speak publicly, look, I have had a few rape and death threats that I had to report to the police, but by and large, it has been overwhelmingly supportive. And we are making very small gains. Like we've had some coverage in the Daily Telegraph in New South Wales, which is sort of just the daily newspaper. We've had Bernard Lane at the Australian. That's always behind a paywall. It's directed at a different demographic, but getting it into like the Daily Telegraph, which is the ordinary newspaper, you know, all the comments are in favour of what we are doing, and everyone thinks this is ridiculous. So I think that we do have the public support, or the polling shows that in other jurisdictions. We haven't had budget to run polling here yet, but it's consistent across all the Western nations that it's at least 2/3 of people want to exclude males from women's sports. So I'm confident that the same thing would be replicated here. And we also need to start putting pressure on the sports organisations that are pushing ahead with this. Like Sport Australia was approached by Claire Chandler about the UK sports guidelines that came out. They did a big inquiry, 18 months. It was a very credible, impartial group that ran that investigation, and they came back saying that you cannot have trans inclusion and also fairness and safety for women in sports. They are incompatible. You need to pick one or the other. So these groups that are pushing trans inclusion, they need to stand up and admit that they've chosen it at the expense of women and girls, okay, because we have the proof now. So Claire Chandler, she was reported in the Daily Telegraph. The Sport Australia was approached asking for what their opinion was on the UK guidelines, and they basically said they would only change the guidelines if the Act is changed. So for Australia, I think we need to see legislative change. So we're working really hard to lobby behind the scenes to make that happen. So we're taking a bit of a different tactic to the other nations just because we're a little bit on the back foot.
Can I hear from you about the kind of opposition you've faced and how this is personally impacting you?
As I mentioned before, I've had a few rape and death threats, which I have reported to the police. Thank you very much if you're watching. But by and large, you know, we've been pretty lucky. We've had Bernard Lane. I'm regularly on Sky News. I occasionally get people giving me grief about that, about being on, you know, Murdoch's payroll. And I'm like, well, sure, why not? I'd love to have a check, you know, because of the amount of unpaid work that we do here. But I actually resigned from my law firm earlier in the year with the expectation of starting with a new law firm, and that didn't happen straight away because of lockdown. So I dedicated myself to this full time for quite a number of months. And to be honest, it didn't break me, but the severity of what was happening to women and the fact that, you know, you're so up against it, I was dreaming about it. I was waking up thinking about it. It can become very, very consuming. And I needed to find some balance. So I think personally it did take a bit of a toll. But I've started with this new law firm who are amazing. And I've had two, I don't quite understand why it's these two particular guys, but two gay males who seem to fancy themselves activists for gay rights, who've written sort of blog hit pieces on me. They don't seem to get a lot of traction. But when I told the partner at work, who's a defamation specialist, he said, well, do you want to do something about it? And I was like, well, they've only got about 2 likes on it, so it's probably not worth our while. So I've had a little bit of that happen. And then I think now that I've got a bit more balance in my life with the law firm, and they let me spend time researching this and so on. So that's been really good. And I think, I don't know, like looking into all of this and doing all the research, it can be consuming because of the magnitude of it and how just obscene it is. Like, say, for instance, with ACON, I noticed there's been some comments in the chat, you know, when we see government funding ACON, which is a charity for gay men, whoever made that comment, that is right, for HIV awareness and prevention, and yet they're going completely off the reservation with no oversight, with no, they're not accountable to anyone, and they're using funds which arguably improperly, because the funds were given to them for HIV awareness, and they're going off and doing all this infiltration of all these government departments. Like, you really do feel like you're in a war, I think, because it is a culture war that we're in, and this has real life ramifications for people. And it really bothers me, like, say, particularly with the sports, that we're going to have to see a girl dead on the field, or a girl dead or with a broken neck in a wheelchair. And the fact that we've been warning about this and they've ignored us, and there's going to have to be some young woman pay that price, or people having their lives, you know, derailed for a number of years because they're getting dragged through the courts with litigation, which is very expensive and time consuming. You're absolutely right. You know, but there are going to have to be some of those women like Marion Miller who are in a position to be brave enough and have enough resources to stand up and fight, and they are prepared to take that hit for the rest of us. You know, but we are dedicating so much time and so many years of our life to this fight, and it can get overwhelming, absolutely. But I also find that having people around me who aren't so invested in this argument, who are willing to listen to me, but who nevertheless believe in me, definitely helps. Women and men from all socioeconomic backgrounds, from all different parts of my life. And of course, you know, just the women's movement itself, you know, we all support each other. We're all able to have a laugh about it. And I think if we didn't have that, you know, we wouldn't be able to do what we do. So
what are the next steps for you and Save Women's Sports Australasia, Australia? And do you have any suggestions for everyone tonight?
Well, similarly to Ro and Linda, seeing what's happening at your grassroots organisations, and if you are being affected, come and tell us. I had a woman, volleyball here in my district, she came to me, and then I had Clarissa Bai of Daily Telegraph approach me, and I put them together, and she got a really big story in on what's happening in women's volleyball. So please share your stories, they're very valuable. Obviously, donations are always helpful. Follow us, subscribe, like, all of that, because as Linda said, we definitely need the numbers. And also, don't underestimate the value of writing a letter, printing it out and actually putting it in the mail and sending it to your representatives, because as I've mentioned, we're going to have to fight this from a legislative perspective. And if your representatives don't know that there's a problem, then if no one's informed them, then they're just going to ignore it. So don't underestimate the power of sending a letter, because when I do my lobbying, particularly when I went to Canberra, they are all aware of it. They are all aware that this is happening, and they're being approached by many people. And so we need to keep up the pressure. So that would be my suggestion for that. Absolutely. And then in terms of what Save Women's Sports Australasia, Australia are doing, just watch this space in relation to legislative change.